I may, I'm just going to start with a little introduction for everyone. And then we're going to start, I can give you an overview of the World Humanitarian Forum, a little bit about today, and then introduce you to my esteemed panelists. So my name's Charlie, and I'm your moderator today. This is the inaugural digital series of webinars with the World Humanitarian Forum. My background spans NGOs. I was director of fundraising for a global youth development program for 6 years or so. I've worked in the government and private sectors, and I currently work for a wholesale bank called Crown Agents Bank, specializing in emerging and frontier markets for clients with a strong focus on development and aid flows. I'm also a member of the World Humanitarian Forum Advisory Board, and I'm really appreciative of you all taking the time today to join us for this inaugural session. So, for those of you that don't know, a little bit about the World Humanitarian Forum. It's the largest and most inclusive non-partisan forum in humanitarian aid and international development. We were supposed to have an event last week at Excel here in London, and unfortunately, due to the pandemic, you're finding us here online, and we've moved forward with our webinar and our digital series. So the fact that we can't come together will not stop us from moving towards our mission and vision. And with great pleasure to be here today with you. This 60-minute session will be moderated by me. Each speaker will have the floor for 10 to 15 minutes each, followed by time for questions at the end. And I've got a number of questions that you've all sent in, so thank you so much, they're great. Today's theme really is about the global context with the increased pressure and complexities. On one hand, the international community must focus on the 2030 agenda for sustainable development and the need to deliver measurable, transformative change. On the other hand, the world has come to a halt, and the COVID pandemic is at the center of combined international efforts. As it was recently highlighted by the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, youth is an essential actor in coordinating efforts to fight COVID-19 and an active and often more vocal partner in demanding real transformative change, taking the lead on several social issues. So our mission at the World Humanitarian Forum is to encourage cross-sector dialogue and partnerships to enable the international community to connect and shape the future for a better tomorrow. In this spirit, the World Humanitarian Forum brings the question of youth engagement and leadership, specifically right now in times of COVID-19. So I'd like to just give you a quick overview of each of my panelists, and then we're going to start with Alex to just give a quick overview of One Young World and his organization. So Alex is the managing director of One Young World. He is based in New York, where he is setting up the US operations for the organization. Alex joined One Young World in 2012 as an intern, and over the years has risen through the ranks. He's now helped steer the organization to where it is today, growing the footprint and revenue. Alex is a passionate advocate of social justice and a strong believer in the power of business and the role the private sector can play in addressing the unequal distribution of resources and opportunities to people at every level of society from every human experience. Alex is committed to forging partnerships between the private sector and civil society organizations in a creative way, whilst delivering valuable SROI. Next on the panel, we have Mursal Hedayat, co-founder and chief executive of Chatterbox. Mursal is co-founder and chief executive of a digital platform harnessing the untapped talent of refugees and other marginalized professionals in online language education. Chatterbox's AI-powered learning platform matches professionals and enterprises in need of language training with refugees able to teach them. She's also the multi-award-winning entrepreneur, recognized by Forbes, MIT, and the FT, amongst others, as a rising star in tech. Mursal was inspired to create pathways into professional careers for displaced professionals after observing firsthand their vast untapped potential as a former refugee herself. And then we have Chebbi, African Union Envoy on Youth. Aya is an award-winning Pan-African feminist. She is the first ever African Union Special Envoy on Youth and the youngest diplomat at the African Union Commission Chairperson's Cabinet. She rose to prominence as a voice for democracy and shot to global fame as a political blogger during the 2010-2011 Tunisia Revolution. She recently received 2019 Gates Foundation Campaign Award She's graduate of the University of Tunis El Manar with Bachelor in International Relations, a Fulbright Scholar at St. George Southern University and Mo Ibrahim Foundation, Scholar for her Masters in African Politics at SOAS, University of London. She is the founder of multiple platforms such as Africa Youth Movement, one of Africa's largest Pan-African youth-led movements, Africist, a youth leadership program and multimedia platform documenting youth work in Africa, and youth program of holistic empowering mentoring, coaching and the next generation to be positive change agents. Great words. She served on the board of directors for Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation, as well as the youngest councillor at the World Refugee Council and youngest commissioner at Oxfam Independent Commission on Sexual Misconduct. Her political blogs that proudly Tunisian were published at Open Democracy and Al Jazeera, amongst others. Since then, she's been traveling across the African continent to support and train thousands of social movement leaders and activists on mobilization, blogging, leadership, and non-violence, and continues to travel the world as a scholar, mentor, speaker, and activist. She was recognized in the 2019 inaugural list of the 100 most influential African women, the 2019 most influential people of African descent in the politics and governance, 2018 Apolitical World most 100 most influential young people in government, and 2016 among 100 most influential young Africans in the world. She has a number of other accolades, but I think we'll stop there. And I'm going to pass over now to Alex to tell a little about himself and One Young World.
Thanks so much, Charlie, and a real pleasure to be here today with you all. So my name is Alex Bellotti from One Young World. We are the global forum for young leaders. We bring together 2,000 delegates every year from every single UN recognized country and from every single sector. We unite them in a different city every year to debate and devise solutions to the world's most pressing issues. We bring together established leaders like Bill Clinton, Justin Trudeau, Mohammed Yunus, with the more emerging leaders who, as I said, come from every single UN recognized country in the world. We source them through scholarships or through our partners who send them. And again, the point of this global gathering is to fast track social innovation solutions. And obviously this year, things are different for us, given the current climate we're in. We're having to reshape the way we do things. So our first port of call was to look at the event itself. The Global Summit, as I said, brings together so many different people from different countries. We immediately get to start thinking about solutions to how we mitigate this problem. So we have officially, in a week, we'll start making announcements about it, but we're looking to move the summit. And then other ways we've tried to mitigate the crisis is by changing our community management model. So previously we had meetups almost weekly. Obviously that doesn't work now. So we've changed that model to online. We've started a series called Together Apart. This is an online series where we bring together our counselors, these established leaders, with the emerging young talent that we have in our community. And it's a really great Q&A where they talk about social issues and its impact on their lives and what they're doing to try and achieve change. We're at 10 episodes now. If you're interested, please do go to our YouTube channel to find out more. The other big thing that we're doing, we're being snowed under right now with amazing stories of impact on the ground on COVID relief. And although we, as a storytelling platform, have a big responsibility and a big power to be able to share these incredibly inspirational stories, we wanted to go a step further and actually help them scale quickly, reach more people, especially at a time like this. So we've set up the COVID-19 Young Leaders Fund. We're pleased to announce that we've just received $75,000 from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Every dollar in this fund goes to these grassroots enterprises. And I'll talk a little bit more further down on this call about what those initiatives look like and what they're doing. There's some really inspirational stories. If anyone's interested after this, you can head to oneyoungworld.com/news. This is where we're sharing as much as possible all the fantastic initiatives being carried out all around the world on COVID relief. And again, we're really proud to announce the launch of this fund, the first of its kind that we've launched. Hopefully going to do some really great work here. Our target is to raise over $500,000 in the next month. It's an ambitious target, but I know we've got the right support behind us. And then going forwards in terms of what we hope to do, as I said, all this money is going directly to the initiatives. And then for the work that we're doing on our side, we'll continue to source, evaluate, and monitor these initiatives that we're finding out from our community on COVID relief. And we use the metrics we always use for social return on investment and for impact measurement. So we'll make sure to keep tabs of exactly how much good is being done, and where we can support and where we can come in and help these initiatives scale quicker.
Thank you, Alex. That's great. It was lovely to hear more about what One Young World does and what you do with them. And I think we'll be drawing out some more of that during the questions. Can I pass now to Mursal? Would you like to tell us a bit about yourself and what you've been doing at Chatterbox?
Absolutely. So thank you, Charlie, and thanks to everyone who is here as a guest. Thank you also for your wonderful introductions. I'm reading them, and great to see so many fellow change makers, tuning in. Not so long ago, maybe 4 years ago, I would have been sitting, perhaps where you are. I was 26 years old when another crisis, another global catastrophe came to our view. At the time, it was the refugee crisis that had engulfed much of the Middle East and Europe. Actually, it was when it arrived in European shores that people started paying attention, including myself as a young person in London, having just completed a degree program and a postgraduate course in social innovation. I guess I was just as hungry as maybe some of the people here to commit my life to doing something more than just making money for other people. And I spotted the opportunity to use the attention that was being directed towards refugees to further goals that refugees like my family would have had. And the solution that arose is perhaps not one that a lot of people would jump to initially. Refugees as language teachers is often mistaken when I pitch it to be a program where refugees are learning languages. And indeed, what our platform does is to tap into a huge unrecognized labor force, highly skilled one as well, that up till 2016 had been consistently ignored by corporations and individuals alike. And it was through looking at this crisis of refugees in a different way, and seeing instead the opportunity that was presented to countries like the UK and countries in Europe and countries around the world, having highly skilled, motivated people wanting to rebuild their lives, and recognizing that one of their talents was languages. That's how Chatterbox emerged. So what our platform does is we are like Upwork for refugees. We tap into their talents, specifically their language talents, and train them and include them in language products for corporates. So we deliver language training for companies like BNP Paribas, McKinsey, charities like the Red Cross that leverage refugees as language teachers. And the hope is that over time, the services that we provide for corporates will increase. And the point of this, it wasn't just to solve an immediate crisis. The point is to change attitudes towards refugees. I mentioned before, and I'll mention again, whenever I pitch Chatterbox, people still mistake that the refugees are the learners learning languages rather than the ones teaching them, because we've become so used to thinking of them as desperate people in need of help rather than people who can indeed help us. And so the Chatterbox platform is thriving. The digital, I think what's interesting about it, and one thing that I'll go into a bit more, is how as young people and being a bit more fluent in the language of technology, our solutions can actually be more scalable and more impactful just using tools that we're quite familiar with. And in terms of the impact of COVID-19, obviously it's impacted the refugee community in ways that are less measured than in my comfortable home in Europe. But we know, for example, that at least one instance of the virus has been found in a refugee camp in Lebanon. and that this is going to be a humanitarian catastrophe once again for a region that's already very unstable and very vulnerable to these types of changes. So I hope to see youths today tackling the issues that intersect between the refugee crisis, technology, and COVID-19. And perhaps some of my words can help to elucidate how that might be.
Thank you, Marcel. That's really interesting and very pertinent to both COVID-19, refugee camps, and what's happening right now. So I'm going to move on now to Aya. Aya, would you be kind enough just to share a little bit about yourself and what you're doing?
Thank you, Charlie, for that very generous introduction. I want to first of all say Ramadan Mubarak for all those who will start observing tomorrow, and send my solidarity to all the Muslims in Africa and around the world. So as you said, I'm a Pan-African feminist. I'm from Tunisia. I was part of what the word called the Arab Spring, but that's a Western narrative. We call it the Revolution of Dignity. And so I had a decade of activism before I was appointed November 2018 by the African Union chairperson as the first envoy on youth. And I'm given a tough mission to serve the largest youth population in the world in 2 years and to engage, especially to challenge old men, how to engage their youth population and why they should care about them. So a little bit about maybe what the African Union is doing, because I know that many people might ask questions on what the EU is doing, and especially on young people. We're 55 countries. And we have a lot of challenges, not only on COVID, but also we have weak health infrastructures. We're already struggling with other diseases like HIV and malaria and Ebola outbreak, and it's adding to us. So even though we don't have the numbers of infection that the world is suffering from, we still have a lot of socioeconomic impact that will affect us. So the African Union actually started the response very early on in February, when we had only few cases in Senegal and South Africa. We convened the health ministers. I think about 30 ministers showed up in Addis Ababa and put together a task force and a joint continental strategy, which I think it was the first as a continental platform, and then also continued with COVID fund, like many initiatives. I'm actually hearing one young word. I'm very proud of the fund you put for young people, because I don't see support to youth organizations yet. So we put also an African or Pan-African kind of COVID fund in response, but also a lot of member states took on the same recommendations to put on national funds to respond to COVID. The chairperson of the union, President of South Africa, also appointed 4 envoys who are business leaders to mobilize private sector and think about post-COVID as well, and the recovery plan. So my office is doing a couple of initiatives, but maybe I'll talk about 3 of them in the sake of time, and you can go to a Youth Envoy website and find out more. The first one is the virtual AU Youth Consultation Series. We started on the 13th of March, just trying to really build a collective youth response and bring young people together in one platform and inform them or empower them with information, because as you know, a couple of weeks ago, a lot of misinformation was circulating. And so the Africa CDC, which is the leading institution on the pandemic, we convened about 11 consultations, around 200 young people from over 40 countries. Some of them also are young women groups who are discussing particularly girls and women. And then they went on to self-organize. So as we speak, many young people around the continent are just organizing these consultations with one standard format of reporting and guiding questions. So I'm really excited to see the outcome of this. But yesterday we turned these consultation to be open webinars, because many young people asked for these briefings to be more accessible. So I hosted yesterday the Africa CDC director. We had 2,000 youth engaged live. We got some commitments from him, and I think that was great to see how we can really bring the AU close to young people, and they were challenging him directly. And at the end, he made a commitment to support a youth-led movement of young people who can fight against COVID-19. And that's what we're doing, basically building a movement to mobilize young people. So we'll continue with these webinars. Next week, we will have the chairperson of the African Commission on Human Rights, because we got a lot of questions, just like you were talking now about the refugees, on the rights of refugees, the right of IDPs, the youth with disability, young women subjected to violence, digital rights. What are we doing about all of that? So I think my role is really to bring decision makers close to young people, to challenge them directly and to demand for their rights and for the right programs that they need to put in place. The second initiative is the African Youth Front on Coronavirus. So out of these consultations, we are trying to put together a multi-stakeholder advocacy group of youth networks to support the continental strategy. So it's going to be an African Union framework that give young people a seat at the table and contribute and report directly to member states task force. And then the last one to conclude with is the African Youth Charter Hustlers. So we're thinking about positioning young people post-COVID and the reform of service delivery, including the improvement of health infrastructure in Africa and dealing with other pandemics, because this is not the first virus and it's not gonna be the last one. And so we're building on the African Youth Charter that we have, which guarantees basically the right of African youth to enjoy their best attainable state of physical, mental, and spiritual health, and really mandates our member states and our ministries to deliver programs for youth. So we will train these young people in advocacy and in pushing for the ratification of the charter and effective implementation of the charter. It's basically youth-led accountability. And so applications are still open till 30th of April. I encourage anyone watching to check it out. And I'm just, in general, I'm just proud of African solidarity and how we have been able to show that, we can lead as Africa, because the media coverage so far has been that Africa needs saving and Africa needs foreign assistance, and will Africa really cope with the pandemic? And Africa dealt with Ebola outbreak, which killed more than 11,000 people. And so I think that narrative needs to change, and what the African Union is doing, what young people on the front line in different countries are doing, is a testimony that Africa is leading, and we just need to recognize that, and maybe the world can learn from it.
That's great, thank you. I think you'll all agree we've got quite an impressive panel here. There's some really interesting things that you've mentioned there. I think most recently, the last point you made about young people and changing the narrative really resonates with me, because doing the same thing is not going to change the outcome. So we all know that, we all know that phrase. So I think this one really is for you and Mursal, actually. Mursal, if I could start with you first. Young people, especially girls and women, face life-threatening risks when attempting to access their rights, whether it be quality education or basic healthcare. With a sort of COVID-19 lens, what role do international organisations and governments have in protecting and promoting their rights? Are you aware of any effective governmental programmes in this area, bar what we've just heard there from Aya?
I think women have always been good at advocating for other women, and the organizations I know of that are particularly addressing the challenges that women face in the context of COVID-19 tend to be women-led, and sadly only women-supported organizations, because often we find men can be a bit blind to this kind of unique view of a problem, shall we say. I think one thing that is clear by now to almost every society impacted by COVID-19, women and domestic violence has risen to epidemic levels. In China, in the United Kingdom, in almost every part of the world, we see that women being kept in isolation at home results in violence against women. There are some wonderful organizations that I know of, one in particular called Chain, which supports women through online resources. What I see a distinct lack of is government intervention to deal with this problem. It's almost as if the invisibility of the issue of women, violence against women and oppression of women is as unnoticed today as it was yesterday and before the coronavirus. I hope that changes. The impact of COVID-19 is not the same on everyone. And I can't speak so much for the youth angle, however, so I hope that my esteemed panelists will be able to fill us in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I know that we touched on this in your introduction, so it might be good for you to share a bit more.
Yeah, I actually haven't seen any really concrete measures towards special economic impact on women and girls, because all the subsidies so far that are put in place are not favoring the informal sector. And yet for Africa, for example, 60% of jobs are in the informal sector. They're considered vulnerable. We are supposed to generate 30 million jobs every year, formal jobs to youth, which is 65% of the population, but we generate only 3 million. And that's even before the pandemic. So I think the women who are in the streets, the women who are in the market, who can barely have minimum wage to be tax compliant, there is no packages for these women and how to protect them during this time. So I would say, if it's a recommendation to organizations who really want to support women and young women and girls, especially the ones who are struggling economically, is to put effort and packages and subsidies into informal sector, micro enterprises, move us from economic empowerment, frameworks or log frames, to economic resilience, provide capital and digitalization of the market, because we're all moving now to online businesses, and yet about 70% of Africa is offline. So even the ones who are out of the digital revolution and out of the internet, which is a privilege in many and luxury in many in Africa, also need to be empowered with technology. So just to touch base also on GBV, I think it's very much linked to economic impact. We cannot control GBV, gender-based violence, if women are not economically empowered, because this makes them vulnerable to be to the power dynamics, basically, to offer them food and care, only to abuse them. And now we see many women and young women and even children locked with their abusers with no legal framework of protection. So there is a lot to do, and the list goes on, really, like access to contraceptives, access to sanitary pads. We see increase of child marriage in Africa. So the list goes on the kind of impact that women suffer from when it's very intersectional to their digital accessibility, economic class, and so on. So I think maybe there are organizations doing amazing work. I don't know, but in terms of government, which I think it is the responsibility of government right now to put in place shelters, centers, safe spaces for survivors of GBV, we're not seeing that. And we're seeing government just putting in place funding that we don't know how are you accountable to spend that funding. What's the percentage of that funding going to youth? Where is it going to women? How are you empowering refugees with that funding in your country? So I think there is increasing lack of accountability to our political leadership, which what I want to see in addressing women issues as well.
Yeah, no, that's really
I'd like to really jump on that, because I think accountability is it. Almost every sector of society in my country, the United Kingdom, that has had support, has had a huge vocal activist group lobbying for their interests. Where is the group lobbying for women's interests? Instead, what we see is, to give you some examples of governments blatantly ignoring the impact of COVID-19 on women. In one instance, several organizations who own hotels in the United Kingdom offered to help with the accelerating rates of domestic violence by offering to act as safe houses for women who are victims. What did the government do? Nothing, completely ignored the offer, and these rooms were not given to the women who needed them. What do you see in the United States? COVID-19 being used as a cloak to drive through anti-abortion measures that will put women in danger. So this is perhaps where the youth voice can be most potent, acting as the voice of the marginalized in this time when the loudest voice is often the ones that are heard.
And that's a really good point, Madeline. I think the youth interest here in terms of being a change agent is absolutely critical to this. Going back to a section just now that when I was talking about people who are economically empowered, what I really liked about what Alex was saying in Percent of One Young World was about how it is marrying both sectors, so the private and the public sector. Alex, is there anything you'd like to add to that point particularly? Because I think you're talking to both international private sector and also to public sector organizations. Is there something more that can be done there? What do you see? What sort of themes?
Yes, absolutely. I've always said that the private sector can and should be doing more for social issues. Just one example of many, we set up a task force to end domestic abuse, and we're asking all of our corporate partners to sign up. It's a very basic thing that should already be happening. There should already be these kind of awareness classes. This should be something that every corporate does as its basic offering in HR. And all we can do is promote these activities, promote these kind of initiatives, and try and get behind them as much as possible. But I agree with Aya, not enough is being done. I certainly haven't seen any governmental programs that have inspired me. So all I can do is my part and try and enact change at a corporate level and try and get businesses to do more. And hopefully we'll slowly but surely get there.
And do you find, I'm just intrigued, what's the reaction you're getting from private sector businesses when you are pushing that narrative through? Do they give you time of day with it, or? Yeah,
I think we utilize the position we're in. Obviously, the One Young World's message is very inspirational, and we've got some fantastic people in our community. The majority of our workforce is female. The majority of our ambassadors are female. The majority of our initiatives that come through are female-led. It really is. We live and breathe that at One Young World. So when something like this Ending Domestic Violence task force was set up, it was so inspirational. The story in itself was so beautiful. It didn't really take much persuading. I can pick up the phone to someone working at a bank and tell them about this, and they would jump at the opportunity of having this amazing young leader. It's Jemima Lovett. They would jump at the opportunity of having Jemima come in and speak to their workforce and inspire them and move them and really resonate with them. So this is something that I 100% get behind, and it's very easy to talk to corporates about, because again, the stories are so moving that there really doesn't take any kind of persuasion. It kind of the stories they really stay with you.
Yeah, I think it's a compelling narrative. So I think this one's probably primarily directed at you, but it's obviously going to be relevant to both Aya and Alex. Refugees are highly skilled with approximately 45% carrying qualifications. That's an enormous stat. How can the private sector assist refugees, especially young ones? And I know that Alex, you've got some experience, but if we start with Mursal, what's your view on that?
So around the time that I started Chatterbox, there were obviously a lot of other youth leaders who were inspired to create their own interventions to help solve the problem of refugee integration. Problematic because it hasn't been done well ever. Refugees are some of the most marginalized people in every society. In the UK, where I'm a resident, they have, in one of the world's most advanced economies, refugees are still experiencing lower rates of employment, higher rates of vulnerable employment, and the work that they can get tends to be low skilled, low paid, with few future potential opportunities. And this is the context, and this is the situation that my parents found themselves in when we came to the UK as refugees in the early 90s. And honestly, it hasn't changed very much at all in 20 plus years since then. And corporates can be part of the solution, but I think at the time when I started Chatterbox, I didn't find very many programs that I thought tackled the root causes of this lack of opportunity for refugees. What needs to change is the perception of refugees. As with most social change, mindsets needs to shift first. And when we look at a refugee, we don't see a talented potential worker. We see someone who is desperate, low skilled, part of a horde of human beings traveling illegally across borders. That is their brand and image. And so through Chatterbox, our work is all about putting refugees into organizations in a context where they are the ones helping, not being helped. The refugees who work on the Chatterbox platform teach their native languages to professionals in huge companies. And what this does is through their HR departments of these companies who buy Chatterbox, it slowly shifts those perceptions away from the charity box and towards the potential hire box. and yeah, it can be done well by corporations, and it can be done badly. I could name and shame a few corporations I think are doing badly, but I won't. Instead, I'll say
not on this platform.
Yeah, maybe not in an article, blog post after this. I'm joking.
Yeah.
But it is really improving, and I think it's a large part thanks to organizations like One Young World, who really bring corporations into close contact with social issues in a non kind of quaint and tokenistic way, in a genuine, deep and meaningful way. So I want to congratulate Alex on his wonderful work with that.
Yeah, the credibility is fantastic that you bring. So thank you. Aya, do you have a view on that, particularly in terms of what else do you think the private sector, with your view as from the African Union, can do? Are there things that you're doing, especially with the young ones, that private sector can learn or do to help?
Yeah, two points actually. One, just to follow up on the responsibility of private sector. I think they have a huge responsibility on the digital divide, closing the digital divide. I mean, the ideas that we're hearing now and the innovation is all digital, but I mean, when people come to Africa sometimes and like they do coding, I'm like, we don't have laptops. How do you want people to use coding? And so there are solutions that work for the world and maybe work for Europe, especially because of the refugee. And I agree completely with you. There is no crisis of refugees, just crisis of leadership. I'm part of the World Refugee Council. We actually launched this week, beginning of this week, a letter to the Secretary General on particularly refugees, and we launched a report. But back to the point, I think for Africa, the context is different. And I think now is the time for private sector to really pull off their responsibility towards closing the digital divide and not leaving us with no access to all these opportunities. So for example, refugees are just locked in the refugee camps with they might have mobile phones, but they don't have access to e-learning. And now that the whole world is locked in e-learning, like all the education is disrupted, then you know what a refugee life is like, right? It's not even 1% what a refugee life is like. But I think we need to look at African countries in supporting the infrastructure for everybody, because if you support the infrastructure of any African country, it can then serve the refugees. And just to also say that we have the largest population of refugees and the largest population of migrants. They've been here for decades, and their African solidarity showed that every one coming from another country is the host, the next door neighboring country. But yet we are still struggling with infrastructure. So even at COVID time now, where our health systems are not accommodating even for citizens who have basic access to their infrastructure, refugees don't have access at all. And so for me, I think private sector now needs to step up to their responsibility. If they want to sponsor all these tech gurus and startups and innovation, they need to first provide us with infrastructures to be innovative. And so in terms of African Union, of course, we work with a lot of private sector mobilization. We launched last year a project called 1 million by 2021, because 2021, the chairperson ends his mandate and all of us end our mandate. And so it's a project to mobilize 1 million, to impact the lives of 1 million youth in each African country in entrepreneurship and employment, education, and engagement, like the 4 E's. And so in that project, we mobilize a lot of private sector, even media houses, and we brought even the FIFA last year into the AU summit. And so we brought different stakeholders together to really engage in what can we do to solve the employment issue in Africa, to be innovative, but also to provide sustainable solutions.
Great. That is quite impressive. I've got a couple more questions on COVID-19 on and around from the audience. So this applies to all of you actually, and it's a view from each of you really. In your experience, what has been the biggest challenge facing young leaders during the COVID crisis? I know one or two of you mentioned the refugee camps in Lebanon, the fact that it's now going to hit, and what that frightening impact will be. But at the same time, Africa is more than capable of doing a lot for itself, and it is able. It's not the first pandemic it's seen, and is well prepared in terms of strategy, probably more prepared than parts of Europe and the States. So I think from my perspective, it's really interesting to hear what you're doing. What's the biggest challenge facing young leaders in your organization around COVID-19? Aya, do you want to kick off?
I mean, many challenges, honestly. To be honest, in Africa, young people have been faced with challenges without COVID-19, challenges of youth unemployment, being hit the hardest by climate change, challenges of corruption, challenges of hunger and poverty. And so I think COVID-19 is actually adding to our burden of things that we're dealing with in terms of development in general. But I think the young people, especially in informal sector who have insecure jobs, young people in very fragile setting and vulnerable communities, informal settlements, are the ones who are the most affected, but also youth who have layers of marginalization. You know, you can be young, female, refugee with disability, and the list goes on. And you find yourself in a situation where you can be in lockdown, you can't even be self-isolating, quarantining. This week, actually, the president of Ghana has reduced measures, and he's saying that we're gonna end the lockdown because we cannot handle the economic impact. And we're estimating that we will have more people probably dying of famine and hunger and malnutrition than actually dying with the virus itself. We don't know if actually statistics are very accurate in Africa because we have the lowest infection rates, but it's because we also don't have the capacity of testing. But at the same time, we have a youthful population. So if we say the elders are at risk, Africa is the youngest continent. So I think we need to put more effort, and the support that should come from the Word to Africa needs to be a lot about economic recovery. And if they really want to support young people, employment and livelihoods, and supporting young people to survive day to day would be, I think, the most challenging for a young person on the continent.
Great, thank you, Aya. Alex, do you have a view there?
I'm speaking from personal experience. The thing that hit us the hardest was, decreased access to funding. I mean, immediately when a crisis like this hits, everyone's in the same boat almost immediately. You're worrying about how do we pay salaries, how do we pay overheads, how do we keep our mission running, how do we keep this organization running? So that for me was the first thought. We're still meeting to try and solve that challenge with our partners. Again, everyone's in the same boat. It's difficult to expect anything of anyone in a time like this. The biggest enemy that I see right now in the fight against COVID is misinformation and fake news, and these infographics that are being spread on WhatsApp and on Facebook. They use scientific language and they use imagery to make it seem like this is official government mandated information, when in fact it's very clearly not. But it's being spread very rapidly, and it's unfortunately taking a hold in marginalized communities. And it's something that a lot of the initiatives that we're funding and we're trying to get behind are helping to fight that at grassroots level. They're really trying to eliminate false information. They're trying to distribute government pamphlets in different languages. They're trying to access remote areas. And again, these are young leaders who are putting themselves on the line. You know, they know that they're exposing themselves to huge risk in doing this work. We've got initiatives of people going to monasteries where they know people go when they're sick, to wipe them down clean and to make sure that those are safe places. They're going to refugee schools to make sure that the schools are fully equipped with all the latest information and equipment. We've got an initiative called Medic Mobile. These guys are going around testing caregivers to make sure that, again, that the elderly and the vulnerable aren't being affected. The biggest thing, the thing that we're proudest of, is those initiatives that do tackle misinformation at its root, especially when it's something like, we talked about women-led initiatives. We've got two amazing ambassadors in Brazil who are trying to fight what the president is saying, and that's them going against the president. So we've got big challenges. It's not just misinformation at a grassroots level in terms of people on Facebook. This is sometimes it's coming from top. I'm not even going to mention what's happening in America right now with our leaders, but it's very disheartening to know that there's people out there working day and night, putting everything they have into trying to get the right information out there. And then you have someone like a president that has access to millions and millions and millions of people and is giving throwaway comments and not thinking about the impact that words have. And again, all we can do is try and fight on the other side and try and mitigate those problems.
I think there's some really good points that you raised there, and it's really interesting to hear what One Young World are doing in response to the COVID crisis, and particularly what young people can do. Your piece there about mitigating that false fake news, that narrative, is I think that has an untold value, because information is king. And I think the social media element, and this is a unique scenario. We haven't had the level of communication and social media that we have now. And I think that, for me, will hopefully propel young people into a more prominent role. Mirsal, do you see, certainly from your organisation and what Chatterbox is doing, the biggest challenge facing you around COVID-19? Particularly, I mean, I think there's a particular one, obviously, with the refugee camps, but for you, with the COVID crisis, what is it?
The biggest challenge during the COVID crisis? I mean, I think you ask anyone, they'll give you a different answer, because we all see things really differently. I think one thing that perhaps hasn't been thought of enough by me or many of the people that I know is the challenge of young people who are still in education, and what this kind of a disruption to their education is, what the long-term impacts of that and the isolation will have on their emotional well-being and personal development. I don't know what the situation is outside of Europe, but definitely a lot of young people are kind of being shoved in front of digital devices and told to make up for all of the social and educational benefits that comes from going to school. I think that helping this cohort of young people to continue their studies is a unique challenge that at least the West hasn't faced in a very long time. And then amongst the young social leaders, I mentor quite a few, and I know that the ones who have programs that aren't digital are struggling now to pivot in that direction. So ones, leaders of organizations who tend to deliver their services or their programs face-to-face are obviously being disrupted very, very harshly. But there are a lot of ways to digitize delivery. And I see a lot of innovation amongst the leaders who have managed to turn their situations around that can possibly be replicated by others. I'm a tech advocate. I think, putting to one side the issues of connectivity and the inequality that results from increasing amounts of work, knowledge, and power moving online, I think it's overall a very good thing. And I think that increases access to things like this talk, which if it had happened in person might have only been heard by a very select audience in one part of the world. And instead now we have, representatives from Jamaica, from Islamabad, from all over the world listening in, and that might not have been possible. So I think it could be, it's a hugely challenging time for social entrepreneurs and social leaders in some ways, but it's also a huge opportunity to leverage the power of technology.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. The technology piece, I think, is key. What and leads me on beautifully to the segue to the next question, which is actually COVID and non-COVID related. What measures are One Young World and the AU Youth Envoy, specifically you, I think, doing to reach out to the young people in rural areas with limited access to internet, with poor access to information, given that our approach must be inclusive and non-discriminatory? I think that touched on the comments that Mirsal just made about that lack of that digital and access, obviously, that Aya mentioned within refugee camps. Aya, would you like to start answering that? Would you like to kick off with that one? Oh, you're on silent there.
Oh, can you hear me now? Yeah, so I mean, for me, again, as I said, I do think that internet and technology is powerful, but the reality is we live in a very unequal world, and 70% of Africa is offline. So when we say rural areas in Africa, it's 70% of our continent, and that is a complete exclusion of youth who don't have access to that information. Couple of things we've been trying to do. One, these consultations, to make them run by youth themselves. So we basically empowered youth through these consultations to be able to run it. So they have a recording of Africa CDC presentation. They have the continental briefing with some of the updated information, and then they can just run it in their own language with their own constituency. And then they send us the report, and we bring that to the policy table. Another thing we've been trying to do is which have been proven to be very effective in Ebola outbreak, is radio, community radio campaigning. So because people have access to radios and listen to radios and even the most remote areas. So we've been also doing a lot of interviews on radios, but also just recording, some short messages to be distributed and aired. And in the same vein of also learning from Ebola outbreak is to really use some messengers to be the credible champions, because whether we like it or not, in Africa, we have distrust between people and especially youth and institutions, and we have a huge intergenerational gap. So the average age of African leadership is 64, and the average age of the population is 20. Like we have 40 years of generation gap, and so young people do not trust governments and do not trust old men who are deciding for them. And before the pandemic, they were on the streets, challenging these leaders. And now during the lockdown, they're like not collaborating and not following the measures. And so one of the really effective tools used in Ebola outbreak is to use the traditional leaders, the chiefs in the communities, the musicians who are very popular, who do all these, they did amazing songs on Ebola, and now actually some of the songs I'm seeing coming out on coronavirus. And people listen to that, and people trust that, and people collaborate with that, because these are trusted leaders, even religious leaders. To your point, Alex, it's really funny to see political leaders diffusing misinformation and themselves not complying by the preventive measures. So we had some leaders in Africa as well who said, we need to continue to go to church because we have only God and faith now to rely on this crisis, And so calls like this, it's not trusted, and it doesn't build that trust. But when a religious leader comes out and say, God is whatever you are, and you can practice your faith whatever you are, then people listen. So I think these are some of the measures we've been trying to also work with young leaders in the community to implement, and some of the technology also have been used very creatively. We saw in Rwanda that the government did some drones who are flying around rural areas with the speaker and informing people about what's happening. It could be scary to some people. What the hell is this? What's going on? But I think we're just trying different creative, crazy things to see how we can cope with the situation. And I think it's just extremely important to reach to our rural areas because they are the majority of our population.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. Alex, would you like to give that one a go? Oh, can you hear? Oh, you're on silent still.
My turn to do that one. No, as I was mentioning earlier, I think the initiatives that I know will help this the most are any initiatives that tackle lack of access to correct information. So whether that's stopping misinformation and correcting fake news, or whether that's services that translate government literature. So for example, one of our ambassadors, Isaac, who's the founder of Slum and Rural Health Initiative, he produced infographics in 55 different languages, most of the local African languages. And these infographics have helped stop the spread of inaccurate information. If he hadn't done this, there wasn't anyone else doing it. These are the kind of solutions that someone just needs to take responsibility and action it and get the information out as quickly as possible, because that's the other thing is timing. That's why we set up the fund. We know that if we don't start things now, it's going to be too late in 3 months' time down the road. We need to really try and nip it in the bud now, both on the misinformation side of things, but also access to the information. So again, we're backing all of those initiatives that do those, at least one of those two things. And again, because it's grassroots, we know and we can see the impact in real time, and it's very easy to track and to measure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Moving on, because I know we've only got about 7 minutes left. I think what do you see the current crisis doing, really impacting the job market for young professionals globally, wanting to make the change and contribute towards the progress for the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, and the need to deliver measurable change? What is that impact going to be? I guess how long is a piece of string? Are you thinking about it now? Is that something your organisations have been working on and having to pivot? Alex, can I start back with you?
So can you repeat the question? Are you asking about what we're doing on the SDGs?
Yeah, it's about the job market really for young professionals, mindful of the change and the contribution they want to make towards the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development with organisations and the need to deliver measurable, transformative change. I guess it's about their choices as well. How are people going to make those choices, and you know, what's it going to do? What's it going to do to people's opportunities?
Well, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I don't think there's many ways to answer that question in a positive light. I always try and think of a positive way to look at things, but unfortunately, right now, obviously, the job market is the worst it's ever been in a long time. And I graduated in 2012, and I thought then that it wasn't a good time to graduate and that it was a poor job market. I can only imagine what the class of 2020 are going to have to face. I think it will take resilience. I think it will take creativity is the right way of putting it, but I think if you're a founder, then you're in charge of your own revenue. So I think we'll start to see a lot more self-empowered staff, if you want to call them that. They'll start their own businesses, they'll start their own initiatives, they'll be responsible for their own livelihood, and maybe that will start a wave. I mean, we've already seen entrepreneurship rise over the last few years anyway. I think what COVID has done is just we'll see a spike in that, especially with everyone being online now. I mean, it's going to be, I've already seen a few things pop up of people that have set up their own companies online in the last couple of weeks. I think it rests on corporate shoulders to dig into their cash reservoirs, which we know they're sitting on. And you know, I don't want to see mass job cuts and furloughing, which we have been seeing. I think as much as possible, we should keep everyone on the right track. But of course, it's very difficult at this time, and there's not any easy solution.
Thank you. And Mursal, maybe we can pick up with you in terms of specifically with your lens on. I think from what Alex is saying, I think that entrepreneurial piece is going to be key. Refugees, I think by default, are pretty brave individuals coming in and reinventing themselves often in terrible circumstances in a new environment. I see a lot of that entrepreneurial spirit coming through. Do you see that yourself with a lot of people that you are working with you in Chatterbox?
Definitely. I think humans are like, you know, grass, they'll grow anywhere if they can take root. And I think the few opportunities that are available to refugees, entrepreneurship is one that's very attractive. And so, you know, most of the big, successful companies around the world have, one refugee or migrant founder, as most of us know. But often these jobs are quite unsecure and insecure, even in the West and even in very developed countries. And what I've been seeing from the refugees who work on the Chatterbox platform, a lot of their, insecure and, vulnerable jobs have resulted in unemployment. So whereas one might have worked, part-time on a 0-hour contract, which means no guarantee of hours in the UK in a school, that job's now been cut and they're not able to access any government support at all. So entrepreneurship in the good times definitely is a pathway out of bad times. We're still very much in them. And it's genuinely, it's been delightful to see that Chatterbox has been a small part of, a good part of the lives of the people who work on our platform. We're one of the only remaining income sources for the people who do work at Chatterbox, where every other job they might have lost, businesses might have failed. At least their jobs on the Chatterbox platform are secure. And I guess the lesson we can take from that, I guess it should definitely be that entrepreneurship is a solution, but not the only solution. It's a very, very risky career.
Yeah.
It's a very risky career at the best of times.
Yeah, thank you. And I think maybe going on to you for the last piece there. I guess you're seeing it from a number of different angles. I'd be fascinated to see your perspective in terms of what that impact might be.
I think for me, the question for Africa is just bigger than entrepreneurship because we have a huge estimation that we would need, I think, $100 billion US dollars to defend healthcare system, but also counter the economic shock caused by the disease. And I think our questions of dependency and reliance on the outside of Africa is our bigger question for our youth employment, whether entrepreneurship or whatever the jobs they want to do. But we rely much on China. It's our largest trade partner with more than, I think, 200,000 US dollars million or billions, you know, to rely on consumption from China. And now that that was blocked and locked down, and China was in lockdown for a couple of months, affected us greatly, even before COVID-19 arrived to Africa. So I think our question there is to see our partnership with the world, relying on Europe, the US, and China, and think about changing our trade pattern with African countries relying on themselves, and also thinking about implementing the continental free trade area, which we entered into force last year in July, which makes us the largest trade bloc in the world. But I think for young people who are listening, or for youth who are engaged with our government, I think that's our way forward. We need to industrialize, we need to feed ourselves, we need to be able to provide consumption for our people. We need to have more sufficient domestic resources for health and enable our health systems. So for me, there is a question of responding now, which I think from the African Union perspective is really negotiating, for example, cancellation of external debts, and the G20 announced some cancellation of debts, but these are quick fix, you know, it's not really a long-term solution. So I'd like to see more an Africa that can feed itself and can really empower its people, and young people can step up to leadership and be the businesses and entrepreneurs they want to be.
Yeah, and I believe right now we're at a pivotal moment which could change the way aid and development is in Africa, for example, is worked. I think it could change the dialogue with it as well, and it could be much more empowering, hopefully, to Africa rather than the traditional idea of aid and development. I think maybe we could change that with the virus. Let's look at the positives that we can draw out of this. We're in a terrible place right now, but I think there's a lot of good to come from this. And with the youth engagement, empowerment, the entrepreneurial spirit, I think it's a really exciting place to be. Can I just take this opportunity to thank the esteemed panel? You are all extraordinary young people I've had the privilege to work with today as a moderator. And I look forward to seeing more of you on other digital webinars that we're doing with the World Humanitarian Forum. So thank you again. Aya in Addis Ababa, Mursal in Lisbon in Portugal, Alex in New York in the US, and I'm in London. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.